When people think of the First World War, they think of soldiers in trenches. They think of mud and blood, of battle and slaughter. This book tells a different story of the First World War, the story of nurses, the women who saved lives. Many worked close to the front lines on what one nurse called the second battlefield, the casualty clearing station, the base hospital, the field hospital. She said it was like working on the edge of a vast raging ocean. Death was like the tide pulling men under. Nurses were fighting to drag them back to life. The purpose of this book, Veiled Warriors, is to tell some of the stories of these nurses, in particular to tell the unknown stories. It was important that somebody tried to capture the whole picture, and as I say, the whole story, the narrative, from 1914 right through to 1918. So that was one of the things I set out to do. The other thing I wanted to do was explode some of the myths of nursing in the First World War. And I felt when I set out that there were three different myths, the three obvious myths. The myth of the bullied VAD, the myth of the romantic nurse, who really only exists as a foil to the hero, the patient or the doctor, and the myth of the nurse heroine. And as I started to study these myths, I realised that actually it's very difficult to write the stories of nurses without creating myths or without tapping into different myths. The myths that they created themselves, some of them deliberately, some of them unintentionally, the myths that were created later, and the very modern myths of nursing. What the book does in the end is examine these myths, maybe play with some of them, and then unearth some new stories that haven't been well known. Mabel Sinclair Stobart's Women's Sick and Wounded Convoy Corps spent a lot of time in Serbia setting up a military hospital and a whole set of dispensaries caring for the civilian population as well. And in 1915, in the winter of 1915, when the German and Bulgarian forces invaded Serbia, a lot of these units had to just join the retreat from Serbia, join the Serbian army and the Serbian nation really. Huge numbers of civilians were forced to retreat across the Alps through Albania to the Adriatic. And again, a lot of myths were created, a lot of newspaper reports told very dramatic stories about the escape of these women's units across the Alps. They'd had to walk about 16 miles every day, and it had still taken them several weeks in winter time. At times they were knee-deep in snow, and they were climbing over these icy paths over the Albanian Alps, sleeping in haylofts or in refuges. One really interesting report from the Manchester Guardian talks about ragged, dishevelled women in gay West End London shops just before Christmas in 1915, and kind of juxtaposes the idea of these refugees just having come back from their amazing experiences in Serbia, these almost near-death experiences, and then shopping in the West End to try and get some new clothes for themselves. And the book looks at this, at the way in which the press is very impressed by these women's experiences and by their exploits, if you like, but it's also almost trying to put them back in their place as women. You know, they're dishevelled girls and they're in the West End shops, so they're shopping when they're seen back in England. The nursing press makes a bit more of their experiences and talks about the nursing work they did. So more important for the nursing profession is the fact that they nursed patients during a typhoid epidemic in the summer of 1915, and they had to wear huge gowns, rubber boots, rubber gloves and masks in the heat of summer to protect themselves against the lice that were causing the typhus epidemic, and that they cleaned the hospitals and then nursed the patients, and in that way saved many lives, before then having to undergo this huge trek in winter in sub-zero temperatures across the Alps. So the stories are very different, they're told in different ways, and I guess in my book I tell them in a different way again.